Good evening, everybody. Uh, Welcome, Dean G. Kill, to the Muncie, Delaware Nation history on Sunday, October 24th, 2021. And just want to say that we're here tonight to continue with the history of the Muncie, Delaware Nation. It's been some time, 3 or 4 months since the last session, and it's time to get back into the swing of things, I guess you could say. So, like I say, Pinjikil, welcome. Dean Deshinzi, Mark Peters. My name is Mark Peters, and I'm the chief here at Nalahi, the Muncie, Delaware Nation, up the river from Nahi, Aluna Pawe Lakawit. And there is a way that people can communicate with me during this live session. If anyone can let me know whether things are, you can see this and hear it. Would be nice to get some response back. But anyway, I'm just going to carry on like as if everything's okay according to my technology here. It looks pretty good. So anyway, tonight I'm going to talk about, as I mentioned in the description of this session, wampum belts and strings, and in particular two wampum belts, one that was exchanged with the Muncie Delawares in 1780, and another one which there's no solid evidence yet, but I'm becoming to believe that it was exchanged with the Muncie Delawares in 1793. So this first belt that I'm going to discuss right here is a belt that hangs in the Museum of Natural History in New York City. It was collected here in Muncie in 1907 from this gentleman that you see in the bottom left corner, a man named Jacob Dolson. And it, like I say, it now hangs in the Museum of Natural History in New York City. And the wording above this belt is that it was made to commemorate a treaty between King George III and the Muncie Delawares in the last half of the 18th century, or the last half of the 1700s. And it has the initials GT, according to this note, which stand for Georgius Tertius, or King George III. We're going to get talking a bit more about that and whether those really are the initials GT or perhaps something else, such as GI or GJ. The second belt is found in what are known as the Simcoe Papers, a collection of documents from Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe. And this is a drawing of the belt at the top of this letter here with the initials either JGS or LGS for John Graves Simcoe, or Lieutenant Governor Simcoe, with two people holding hands, two stick figures holding hands. And it was obtained from a man named Willis Tobias in Alunapawi Lakawit, or Moravian town, Nahi, down the river from us here, and is presently apparently in the hands of Indian Affairs, or what we call Indigenous Services Canada, here today. And we're going to be trying to find this actual belt and see if we can get some updated pictures or information on it. Both of these belts were not given from the Munseys to the British, but were in fact belts that were provided from British officers to the Munseys on in these particular years, 1780 and 1793. And with the GI belt or GT belt, this one here, there's a record that when it was given to the Munsey Delawares, we returned a white belt to the officer, the superintendent of Indian Affairs, Guy Johnson, at that particular time as well. And we're going to talk much more about that. However, there is no record really that we've been able to find yet regarding this belt that was obtained in Moraviantown. The one with the JGS or LGS. The Munseys say that it represents an agreement for lands on the south side of the Thames River, which had been purchased by the British in 1790, and lands to be promised on the north side of the river when it was purchased at a later date. The description in the letter that is below this belt from Moraviantown surely suggests that it is a belt that was provided by Lieutenant Governor Simcoe. And just to make it maybe clear, in addition to Munseys, Delawares, and all other First Nations in the Great Lakes and Northeast using wampum to represent important agreements and other events, the British learned this way of doing things very early on and made sure that it also had these belts ready to be given to First Nations and reciprocating the belts they were given at times of important agreements and events. Like I say, there's no record in particular yet about the second wampum belt, but from the letter, like I say, it refers to a belt that would have been given by Lieutenant Governor Simcoe and could very well have been given by him to the Munseys when he came through here in Muncie in February 1793 with 7 of his officers, as well as accompanied by Joseph Brant, the Mohawk chief Tyandanega, and 7 of his warriors who stayed overnight and had a council here at that time. It's kind of strange that there's no record of this in any official government documents at this time, but we're going to talk more about that as well. From the Munsey point of view, though, there is a record of this bout, this agreement with Lieutenant Governor Simcoe, and this is in a petition that was sent by the Munseys to the Crown in May 8th or 9th or rather of 1826. And in this last paragraph, it talks about, we have long been in undisputed possession of these lands that we're talking about here on the Thames, and we're given permission to take it by the owners, the Chippewas, and other Western Confederacy nations. And we have made it valuable by our own labor, and besides which Governor Simcoe affirmed it to us. He came and camped there and learned the history of our nation from our chiefs, and he told us to stay and to be good and strong, and we should keep it. And when he bought the remainder of the lands, which is on the north side of the Thames River, from the Chippewas, he would make us a deed. This was afterwards given to a chief, Captain Quakow or Kanow. The spelling's not clear. And this can all be confirmed again by the old Chippewa chief, Tamago, who is still alive, and we'll be getting more into these details at a later time, not tonight, but when we get into the 1820s, we will. And this petition is signed by the Muncie men from here, where I'm talking from right now: George Turkey, Cornelius Westbrook, John Logan, Thomas Snake, and William Half Moon. So this talks about this overnight stay by Simcoe and Joseph Brant in February 1793, when this second belt with JGS or LGS was given to us. And this land, according to the Muncie statements from the 1820s and on, consisted of 12 by 12 square miles that were promised to us by Simcoe at that time. You can see from this first survey of the Thames River, the area that I'm talking about, where the Muncies are now. A little hard to see on this map, but if we go to this one, it's a little more clear. This is, like I say, the first survey of the Thames River in 1790 to 1795, and it shows 3 Delaware villages along the Thames, as well as a Chippewa village up north from where we are at this particular time. And as I mentioned, we were promised by Simcoe land on the south side of the river here, where we had cornfields and crops and other farming land, and it was purchased from the Chippewas in 1790. And it was also understood that when these lands on the north side were purchased, we would be given a deed for land on that side as well. And even this gentleman here by the name of John Norton, just gotta check the comments here. Looks like we're on. Okay, just double checking. This man John Norton, he was kind of the right-hand man of Joseph Brant and during the War of 1812. He's a very interesting character, and there's a book about him. And there's also journals that he wrote that talk about our involvement with him, as well as the Chippewas during the War of 1812. And a letter found by one of our researchers, Laurie LeClaire, it is said by Norton that we should have a right to this 12 by 6 square mile area of land that was promised to us earlier, and especially in exchange for our alliance during the War of 1812 and our suffering significant casualties during that war. What it does, it shows a continued alliance from what we're going to get into in a little bit after the American Revolution, where we also allied with the British Crown. There's a lot more to say about a lot of this stuff, but I can't say it all, unfortunately. So, like I said, this GIGT belt, the one that hangs in the museum in New York City, represents an agreement between the Muncies and the British Crown during the American Revolution that led us to move from the areas we were in New York and Pennsylvania and Ohio to this area on the Thames River where we are now, and which likely occurred between 1780 and 1782. And the second belt that was provided, I believe, when Simcoe came through here in 1793, is basically a confirmation of that first belt with a description of the amount of land that was promised to us by Simcoe at that time in 1793. And also according to our Munsee leaders, as I mentioned in that petition, as I'm calling it, from 1826, and a number of other petitions, 23 that I have, going until the year 1909, where we continue to say the same story over and over again to get justice as far as our the promise of land made to us. The Munsees, the Delawares, Munsee Delawares, and all First Nations in the Northeast and in the Great Lakes areas have always used wampum and strings to represent important words and agreements. And there's lots of information, I guess you could say, about what that means, but I'm going to refer to a document here. It's from a man, lieutenant governor at the time in 1836, Sir Bond Head, to Lord Glenelg in England. And this just gives you a description about what wampum means to First Nations people from a colonial point of view even. It says, an Indian's word, when it is formally pledged, is one of the strongest moral securities on earth. Like the rainbow, it beams unbroken when all beneath is threatened with annihilation. The most solemn forms in which an Indian pledges his word is by the delivery of a wampum belt of shells. And when the purpose of this symbol is once declared, it is remembered and I'm not sure that word is remembered and passed down from father to son with an accuracy and retention of meaning which is quite extraordinary. Whenever the belt is produced, every minute circumstance which attended its delivery seems instantly to be brought to life. And such is the singular effect produced on the Indian's mind by this talisman that it is common for him, whom we term the savage, to shed tears at the sight of a wampum which has accompanied a message from a friend. I mention these facts because they will explain the confident reliance the Indians place on the promises which, accompanied by the delivery of wampum, were made to them by our generals during and at the conclusion of the American Wars. And he's talking about the War of 1812 and the American Revolution. These ceremonies then probably little effect upon our officers, some of them, but when they sank deep in the minds of the Indians, the wampum thus given having been preserved and now entrusted to the keeping of the great orator who was present at the council I attended on Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron, and in every sense These hieroglyphics are moral affidavits of the bygone transactions to which they relate. On our part, little or nothing documentary exists. The promises which were under, whenever they might have been, were almost invariably verbal. Those who expressed them are now in their graves. So it really talks about, and even the British were quite aware of the importance of wampum, as this letter from a colonial official describes, and it describes the honor and the integrity involved in using wampum to make these agreements, and the way these agreements were then transmitted, like he says, from father to son through generations, through a oral type of traditional history. And these are what were recorded in the petitions from the Munsees to the government that were written down, these oral traditions about this. So I just wanted to give an idea, really, of what wampum means and how important it is in these types of agreements and talks. The belt that I had mentioned here with the GT on it, according to the words in the description in the museum, it turns out that it in fact might be the initials GI or GA, based on records of a similar belt being given by the Superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1780, Guy Johnson. And I'm going to have a lot more to say about this actual transaction in part 2. I don't think I'm going to get this all done tonight. I started out thinking this would be about a half hour, but I think it's looking like an hour and a half to 2 hours. So I'm just going to do parts 1 and part 2. Part 1 tonight and part 2 tomorrow night. And I'll get a lot more into this exchange of wampum with Guy Johnson tomorrow night. But the belt that I'm talking about, the GT GI belt from Guy Johnson, took place at a time when the Munsees were recovering from severe destruction by the colonial governments of America, the rebels, as we call them, during the American Revolution. And you can just get a little look at what these villages might have looked like. This is an example on the bottom right of what a village might have looked like during that time period, and other scenery from that time. But when we got to the point of the exchange of this belt, like I say, we had been devastated by colonial attacks. There's note that by this campaign of Colonel Broadhead of the U.S. Militia of destroying 7 Munsee villages and razing the villages and looting the villages of $30,000 worth of things that were left there that we couldn't take with us as we fled their advance. As well, they burnt all the crops and other food sources in September 1779, just as the harvest was beginning. And it was done as revenge, in a sense, by the Americans to us, the Munsees, and the Six Nations as well, for our part in siding with the British and causing devastation in the areas where we used to have our traditional lands, basically, in Pennsylvania, and New York, and New Jersey. Over 130 cabins were destroyed by Brodhead on his trip up the Ohio area river. Rivers, I should say. So, just going to give a little outline of this area so people know where it is. So if you go to the left, you'll see the Ohio and Allegheny rivers going up towards Lake Erie. And that's where Brodhead's campaign was in September 1709 and destroying the 7 Muncie villages at that time. And as well another campaign by a man named Colonel Sullivan came up the Susquehanna and all the way up into the Muncie areas in the north branch of the Susquehanna. And by this time, we'd been living in these villages for a good 40, maybe 50, 60 years after having been driven out from our lands on the Delaware River, and had made decent permanent villages over that time. And then once these 2 campaigns took place, with Brodhead and Sullivan destroying all of our villages and food supplies, we were forced in to the Niagara area, the area of Niagara Falls. And during that time, after our villages were destroyed in September 1709 time period, that winter turned out to be one of the coldest winters ever experienced in this area by people who had memories of the weather back then, I guess you could say. But it was cold with deep snow, and food was really scarce. Hunting was pretty well impossible, and many people died of starvation during that period. This picture here is a picture of what's known as the Battle of Chemung that Sullivan would have taken part in against us during that period. This picture here is a picture of Colonel Brodhead, the man responsible for destroying many of our villages on the Ohio and Allegheny. And this picture here is a drawing of what might be the first Trail of Tears, really, perhaps showing the Muncies and Delawares and other people having to move in advance of these American armies coming in to destroy our villages. So that hundreds, even a couple thousand people were forced to flee in advance of these armies that were coming into the Detroit area. And this is a drawing of what it may have looked like during that exodus, you could say. So as we got into this area in Niagara, we were also sent belts from the Western Confederacy, composed of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Chippewas, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, as well as the Wyandots or Hurons. And these belts came to us, the Muncies and Delawares, inviting us to move into the lands of the Western Confederacy based on the experiences we'd had with the American army up to that point, and losing, like I say, all of our villages being destroyed by them. I'm going to have a little bit more to say about that as we go along as well. I mean, we'd had a long-standing relationship with the Western Confederacy as it's becoming known during the American Revolution times. As I mentioned in previous sessions, we were found to be visiting the Miamis south of Lake Michigan in 1680 when the explorer La Salle came through that area on behalf of the French, actually, and he noted the, as he called them, loups, wolves, or Munsee people who had been residing there for some time already, and then later moved back to the Delaware River after this rather long visit. But it shows the, I guess as you could say, the extensive, the long-term relationship we'd had with the Western Confederacy even before this period in the late 1700s. And there's no doubt this relationship would have gone on long before La Salle came into the picture as well. And there's numerous references during this period of the American Revolution and afterwards that we were known as the grandfather nation to the Western Confederacy peoples, and held that position of esteem at that time. So here we are, at the end of the around 1780. As I mentioned, we're forced up. We've been forced from the Susquehanna River area over into Niagara, as well as the Ohio and Allegheny River areas up into Niagara. And that's where the Indian Superintendent Guy Johnson comes into the picture. And when we arrived in that area, it was his opinion that we should move into the areas of what's known as Cattaraugus. It's hard to see here, but well, I guess it is on this map here. Cattaraugus. This map doesn't come out too good, but if you can see Lake Erie here on the right part of Lake Erie, you'll see two reservations that are in dark square types of shapes here. One is Cattaraugus, and the other, I believe, is Tuscarora. But the British were thinking that we could move into this area of Cattaraugus, or an area known as Genesee as well, on the Genesee River in this square just below Lake Ontario. So that's the British thinking once we had moved into this particular area in Niagara. However, and it was the position of the Six Nations as well with the British that we should move into those areas. However, after we received the invitation from the Western Confederacy, and in particularly the Chippewas, we decided that we were just going to move into what was then known as Quebec, actually, and later became known as Upper Canada, and in particular to the Thames River. So that is where we are now, on the Thames River. And in the during the time that we were at Niagara, as I've been saying, we got to know and whoops, getting my paper stranded around here, sorry. And have meetings with this Indian Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Guy Johnson. That's not him in this picture. I do have a picture of him somewhere. I'm not sure where it is, but either way. So there we are. We are in the Niagara area now after we lost our villages on the Susquehanna and Ohio and Allegheny River areas. But before that, in 1777, Henry Hamilton, and this is a picture of him in this square here at a fort where he's greeting the Americans, actually. He held a large council in Detroit, and the Delawares and Muncies were there. And in exchange for our loyalty to the British against the rebels, Hamilton said this. He said, "I do assure all such that are inclined to withdraw themselves from the tyranny and oppression of the rebel committees and take refuge in this settlement," Detroit is where he's calling this settlement at that time, "or any of the posts commanded by His Majesty's officers, shall be humanely treated. They shall be lodged and victualled," which means given food, "and such as come off in arms, and as shall use them in defense of His Majesty against the rebels and traitors, to the extinction of this rebellion, shall receive pay adequate to their former stations in the rebel service, and all common men who shall serve during that period shall receive His Majesty's bounty of 200 acres of land." So he's talking about both First Nations loyalists and other non-First Nations loyalists who, if they're willing to fight for the British, then they are going to be taken care of and even rewarded afterwards. And then the next year, in 1778, another meeting is held with the Delawares present again at Detroit. And during this time, Chamintawa, a village chief, spoke on behalf of the Three Fires Confederacy. Referring to the Delawares as grandfathers, he then presented several wampum belts to them, stating that he also represented their war chiefs. He asked us to assist the Western Confederacy in their wars against the Americans and hope for sincere loyalty, as we sometimes take your hearts to the Virginians, but we beg you will now leave them here, where ours are all assembled. So this is again the direct invitation of the Western Confederacy to the Muncie Delawares to fight with them also against the rebels, the Americans. And then later in January of 1779, the rebel general Lachlan McIntosh informed that he was going to take a militia from Pennsylvania and march secretly to the forks of the Allegheny, where some Mingos and Muncies were settled, and who have done much mischief, and endeavor to cut them off. However, this mission was unsuccessful, as were many other missions of these rebels that we were able to fight off. However, in September of that same year, 1779, this Colonel Broadhead that I had mentioned, in August of that year, started off on a march up the Ohio and Allegheny rivers to destroy the Munsees and other First Nations that were living along that area. It mentions that this march led to the death of a notorious Munsee chief, although it doesn't say the name of this chief, and that they were able to take plunder and captives. Plunder, loot was a big part of the incentive for some of these military Americans to be able to take what we couldn't take with us as we escaped, and it's kind of like theft, really. But like I say, at the same time, General Sullivan was coming up the Susquehanna and destroying all of our villages along that river as well. And got a map here of that somewhere. Thought I did. Well, I guess I didn't include the map that I wanted to include. But basically, this is it. If you can see here, on the left is the Allegheny, basically, river, and it shows the dots there of Broadhead's campaign up that river to destroy our villages. And on the right, you can see some dotted lines with arrows, and that's Sullivan's campaign up the Susquehanna to destroy our villages along there, as well as any Six Nations villages that they could destroy at the same time. So it was quite the campaign to do us a lot of harm. And like I mentioned, Broadhead says he leveled 8 villages, 1 Seneca village and 7 Munsee villages. They destroyed 600 acres of crops, cutting down corn and piling into heaps before burning them. He claimed to have leveled over 100 homes and then collected a booty, looting of some $30,000 worth of property that we had to leave behind to escape them. Their soldiers were able to take this, what they called booty or loot, from these raids before they burnt our villages down. Despite the devastation of these villages, the casualties were low. Like I say, we had advance notice that they were coming, so we were able to all, and again, as noted in this picture here, move collectively, hundreds of people, a couple thousand actually, between the Susquehanna and Allegheny, moving into the area of Niagara. So by the time we get there, they destroyed, 130 cabins just along the Allegheny River itself. And I think I'll switch these scenes here. the record shows that sometime in the winter of 1779, 1780, the Western Confederacy, as I mentioned, and this is a picture of, as I noted earlier, of the nations of the Western Confederacy. And they had sent us belts on the Ohio, the Delawares and Muncies on the Ohio. They had sent us belts warning of an attack on our settlements and inviting us to live among them in their own territory. And at Niagara, a council with Sir Guy Johnson, as we're going to get more into, was called in early March of 1780. And the Delaware chose a Seneca chief by the name of Cayasuta to speak for us at that time. And this is a picture of painting of Cayasuta. Very interesting person. A Seneca chief, like I say. And he was at the Treaty of Easton as well that we have talked about before, and as well during the French Indian or 7 Years' War, he was very prominent. But our relationship with the Senecas that during those periods was such that we asked Cayasuta to speak for us on a number of occasions, and he did so. He informed Guy Johnson that the Ohio Delawares, having had their villages destroyed by the Virginians, the Long Knives, we were offered a place of asylum by the Western nations. And Johnson's journal records that the Hurons, the Chippewas, had sent belts and messages to advise the Delawares to leave that country, the country south of Lake Erie, and come into their neighborhood where they would live at peace, and that some of them had heard that it met Colonel Johnson's approbation, so believing that Colonel Johnson was okay with this as well. However, the following day, on March 3rd, Johnson states he was informed that our brothers the Delawares had received belts and messages from the Hurons and Chippewas, and advising them to remove and settle amongst them, as they found the place they were at present settled was liable to be insecure and liable to be disturbed by the incursions of the rebels, and was much surprised to hear that I was mentioned as countenancing and approving this measure. So we've got two kind of things going on here. We've been forced to move into Niagara by the American military during this time in the American Revolution. We come there and we're sent belts from the Western Confederacy to continue to move either west or north into, like I say, what was called Quebec, but then became Upper Canada, southwestern Ontario. And at the same time, we're getting involved in talks with Guy Johnson now, who doesn't quite agree with us doing that. He is of the opinion, as well as the Six Nations, are trying to influence us into hanging on in these particular areas and moving to the area of Cattaraugus, New York, like I say, which is just south of Lake Erie, and or over to the Genesee area, which is west of the Niagara area. So when we get back into what's going to be part 2 of this tomorrow at some point, we're going to see how things develop in our discussions with the superintendent Guy Johnson over the next few days, and how irregardless of his views on where we should go or the Six Nations, we decide to accept the invitation of the Western Confederacy, the Chippewas, and move north across the lake at Niagara Falls and into what is southwestern Ontario today and to the Thames River. So I'm just going to end there, but it's also going to raise the question of who has authority here in a sense. The lands in the Western Confederacy areas are still all First Nations lands, have never been surrendered, never been sold or taken in any way. And so we are relying on what you would call indigenous law or customs to move into these areas. And we'll see how that interacts with British sort of legal system after we talk about our meetings with Guy Johnson and before we moved into southwestern Ontario. So I hope that's not too complicated, but anyway, I'm going to end there tonight for part one, and we'll be back for part two tomorrow, perhaps at 7 or sometime during the day even, but I will put a posting out about that tomorrow morning. So, Lapish Kanal Walomwa, we will see you all again, and Anishik, thank you. Good night.